Hey, readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're watching Fictitious, a show about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. I'm joined in this episode by Claire Holroyde, author of The Effort. In this spec-fic sci-fi novel, the Earth is threatened by an extinction-level event when an 8-kilometer dark comet emerges from behind the sun on a rapid collision course with our planet. Immediately after discovery of the comet, an international coalition of scientists is assembled and nicknamed The Effort. Under the leadership of NASA's Dr. Benjamin Schwartz, a specialist who has spent years modeling impact scenarios, The Effort is tasked with nothing less than assuring the survival of humanity. But their mission, which would require years of preparation under any reasonable circumstances, has only months before the insane velocity of the comet brings it within range. At Ben's side are the most powerful minds in space travel and nuclear science, supported by his tech recruiter girlfriend Amy Kowalski, the brilliant polylingual Kenyan interpreter Love Magwani, and the might of the United Nations. Against them are political power structures unwilling to commit resources, global chaos erupting as the world population faces the reality of extinction, and the ticking countdown of precious time slipping away. Near the North Pole, a Coast Guard ship full of climate scientists investigates withering ice and dying animal life. Cut off from land and family, photojournalist Jack Campbell and marine biologist Maya Gutierrez stoke flickering sparks of romance amid a suffocating existential despair. And in New York City, Love's left-behind girlfriend Rivka struggles to survive in a city falling to violence and starvation. The Effort is apocalyptic fiction focused on truly human stories, how we survive together or die divided, protecting the disappearing beauty of our fragile world or succumbing to annihilation. And it's available now from Grand Central Publishing. And Claire, welcome to Fictitious.
Hello. That was amazing. Can I bring you with me next time someone asks what my book is about? And I'm just going to be like...
I'm a great presenter. Yeah, you can just wheel me into the podium. I can do here's the story, and then wheel me right out and you can answer all the questions. I've literally done that before. So yeah, it's kind of my shtick. So, clearly from what I've described at the top here, this is a pretty heady story with enormous, the biggest stakes, really. There is a really large cast of characters. There is a lot of ground to cover in this. I was just thinking about how I would describe The Effort to people. I kept thinking about the idea that I was like, you couldn't make this into a movie. This would have to be like a long-running series because there are so many B and C plots. There's so much ground to cover. This is not, your Armageddon or Deep Impact of movies past, kind of stuff like that. There's a lot more going on to this. Now, clearly I gave the big wordy description there, but how do you pitch this? Is there a pithy version of this story, your elevator pitch when you describe it to people?
Well, you did a fantastic job. But yes, if I'm in an elevator and have 2 seconds, I would say it's what happens to society and to people when an extinction class comet is discovered with less than a year to impact. And then I would exit the elevator. So that is kind of as small as you can get, but there's a lot going on. And definitely there's an international ensemble cast. There are multiple missions, but it's all the theme of saving the planet.
I feel like if you did tell that to somebody in the elevator and then walked out, you would be leaving them in quite an emotional state, just trying to fathom that idea. And certainly the novel kicks right off with the discovery. There's no precursor of getting to know you ahead of this thing. It's basically like the discovery of the comet happens, and then everything kicks into gear from that. There's no wasted time in that stuff. And we're going to dig into a lot more of what it's like writing this, I called this kind of speculative fiction. It's definitely sci-fi, but at the same time, I think of it spec fic because it's set in our world. It's set in a situation that feels like it could be all too plausible. And certainly the themes that you just explore in this novel and the idea of societal collapse, of panic, of overreaction. I don't know if there's a way to overreact to the end of the world, but still, in ways that cause these massive issues. There are very, very big things to explore in this, and you have a lot of ground to cover in this story. Thematically, when you sit down to write about this, first off, what brought you to say, okay, I'm going to write about an annihilation level, extinction level event of the planet? What drew you into something like that? And what were you thinking at the time, thematically you wanted to explore?
So the cosmic collision began. So in 2003, I believe it was, there was Mars made a close pass to Earth, and it was in a newspaper science section, and observatories around the world were celebrating and were excited, and I remember thinking like, how close are we? What are we talking about here? And everyone looked really happy, and it was relative. It was close was still further out than one would expect close, but it just got me thinking about cosmic collisions, and I started researching how often they happen. And I started just imagining what that would be like, how an impact would be covered in the press. Would it be covered in the press? How people would react, how society would react to a timer. And so that just kind of started one theme. I was also writing about, I guess, a polar icebreaker and the idea of extinction. And I think we're on our sixth mass extinction right now. Thinking about climate change and how much of our natural world is under threat or already destroyed. So I was already writing that as well, and they just kind of became the same story of wanting to save the planet, both from all threats, from a comet threat, from ourselves, honestly. So it just became one big mission, just with different factions. But yeah, so that's kind of how the idea started.
There's a moment in the novel where this character, Ben Schwartz, who's one of the lead scientists involved in the effort, is discussing with his group the fact that they're at least a month out from being able to pick exactly what the trajectory of the comet is and where it would potentially hit. And they talk about the fact they're like, even when we know, there's no way we can release this information because it's incredibly dangerous, because it will change how people on the planet will react to it. Because let's say it hits on the trajectory to hit Russia, Russia will freak out, but other parts of the world might be like, I don't know, maybe we just let it do that. Not, because there's this like selfish, recursive thinking that happens in politics and in circles that really lack empathy. And then pretty much a chapter later, somebody basically leaks their idea of where this thing could hit. And then it sets off this cycle of people saying, debunking it, but then predicting the next thing. And it got me really thinking about our present moment and how there are times where transparency and the truth is something that we want disseminated, and other times where we can clearly see that release of any kind of information in the era of fake news, in the era of people not trusting the media or trusting strange sources that really are not vetted in any way, that it's bad enough considering the things that have happened in this country just in the last few months, in the last few years, let alone what would happen if the entire world was suddenly under the threat of impact like this. And I was really curious about, for you, writing this novel clearly has impacts from things that have happened over the last like 4 or 5 years. And I want to get more into that in a minute. But thematically, did you find things evolving in the story, things changing, where you were like, oh, I've just seen proof of how humanity would react in some of these situations, and ways that we would work against our own self-interests, or the way that we would still put money or influence or fame over the actual need of people in a situation like that. I mean, what was that like for you in the construction of this novel?
Yeah, I started the novel, I would say, the end of 2016, with a plan that definitely altered or grew in a certain way because of what I was experiencing, and that ended up in the book. I would even give even a small example of a character who goes to the whitehouse.gov website to look for an existing plan of planetary defense that did exist, and he finds a blank page that says, "We'll get back to you with more information." That actually happened. In my research, I went to the whitehouse.gov site, and the planetary defense had been yanked and not replaced. So had the page on climate change and LGBT rights, LGBTQ, sorry, rights. And it felt very strange. Just that information and a stand would be taken away and not responded to again. And that's just one small example of how I felt that a lot of current events were kind of reacting to me, and not only in America, but in Brazil as well. The Brazilian president, as I was researching the Amazon and writing about the Amazon and in the indigenous tribes, In 2017, Tamer wanted to open up the Rensa Reserve to mining, and that included indigenous lands. And I hadn't heard from this tribe in 40 years. I was reading a book, and they had just gone quiet, and I was just praying that they would be safe. And then that happened. So that came into the book. There were activists that were killed. There's so much had happened as I wrote the book that it was a choice, and I decided to let it in rather than. I know that in science fiction, sometimes people want stories to be timeless for all readers, but I chose to bring in. It was too important, I felt, and it was too important to me to not include that in the book.
I think when you're constructing fiction, you either do have to choose, like, am I setting this? I mean, that's the beauty of secondary world, and in some things where like you can set it apart from our moment in time. Our fiction will always reflect our moment. It will always reflect the idiom of our culture, of where we are in a specific moment, and we will always look back on it through a different lens. I mean, we can see that now when we look back at the fiction of the 70s and the 80s and 90s and see how much our viewpoints have changed culturally when we look at a lot of those things. But putting something right smack dab in the present is a challenge in itself. I mean, because you were trying to reflect the moment. You're trying to be sort of prescient for things that may happen or may evolve within the year or so of publication. And there's so much of great sci-fi that places its timelines right in the middle of things we've already experienced. I mean, you can't see it in the shot here, but I have a poster for Transformers the movie, the animated film from 1986, which is a formative work for me. And it starts right off with a narration that goes, "The year is 2005." And as a kid in 1986, 2005 felt so far away. It felt like the future. Now we're sitting in 2021 and the world's a mess, and I'm just like, oh man, maybe we predicted things poorly. I was expecting the robot apocalypse, and instead we just got really stupid humanity. And, so it's a pitfall of that kind of thing, but also it kind of anchors a moment in time. And I think you create sort of a time capsule for the anxieties of the moment, of all the concerns that we have. And clearly climate problems are a big one. Social upheavals are a big one for sure. And so, I mean, that is a lot to absorb and then translate into a novel like this. How did this affect you in writing a novel with these heavy themes? Because we're going to dive more into like what you did for research and because you've mentioned a little bit of it there, because it's really important for a novel like this. But I mean, just impact on the writer. You have to spend a lot of time absorbing some really dark, heavy stuff. What was that like for you, and how did you deal with that over the course of creating this novel?
I feel like I've had my hands tied though, as I watch, like the last wild places on Earth, which would be the Arctic and the Amazon, being destroyed. That was before I wrote the book. I felt that way. And so as I was writing the book, all of a sudden, and I'm only halfway through, and I felt like someone put their finger on the fast forward button. And then it was like, oh my God. And so I guess you can see my frustration and despair in the book, but also my fight, like rising to the fight of it. And I could solve certain fights in the story. Maybe that's, where that comes out. Like I want to save the earth, and I can do it here. I might not be able to do it in the real world. Also, I will say that yes, the book can get definitely dark. I feel like it also has a lot of light though. I am in love with the characters, and I was always with one of them when I was writing it. So it was never totally dark. And there are moments of beauty, both big and small, I think, in the book that kind of held me through. I wouldn't have been able to write it if it was only, nihilism, pitch black kind of thing. There was definitely a fight, and I had company on that journey.
I like that you mentioned there that basically this, in a way, kind of gives you an empowerment to fight for something that you love, environment, the world, the beauty of our natural landscape. One of the things that's great about fiction is that it empowers us, at least with the sense of hope, with the sense that we can enact change, even if it is small and incremental. And, clearly a lot of the advances our world has made has been pulled right from the ideas from science fiction over the years. And so certainly science fiction's been really prescient about a lot of things that have happened over the last couple of years. I've had several different authors on this show that had books that directly hit on ideas of pandemics and all of these, different kind of scenarios where the world went to hell. And they wrote them ahead of COVID and then had to deal with promoting a book in the middle of those things and being like, oh, I accidentally predicted a lot of this stuff. And that's a weird spot to be in, because you don't want, as fiction writers, the world that you create, unless it's a utopia, you don't want to see it show up in real world around you, and that can be, I think, challenging to market under, to live under. I like what you said there about having light in the novel, because certainly I don't have the temperament to sit through enormous, bleak, ongoing stories in that way. Like, I'm not a fan of The Walking Dead for exactly that reason. I just can't exist in a world that pessimistic that long and find it good for my mental health. So I do appreciate that this story, while it can be bleak and it is obviously about very dark things, that there is so much humanity. There is a sense of hope. There is a sense of togetherness either in there, even while facing the idea that a lot of the world is like hopelessly stupid. That's probably reductive for me to say it that way, but it's a frustrating moment. So that's how I have to look at some of it. In telling a story like this, I mean, so this is set in our real world. It's clearly influenced by those things that have happened since 2016. I mean, I think anybody reading it is going to recognize echoes of the political climate over the last 4 years, particularly the leadership that's in there, even if you never call it by name. We'll know it when we see it, and it's just as annoying, to see it in vagaries as it is in real life. But how do you ground a novel like this for the reader when it's set in a world that they recognize, but it's going to be in places that they don't? Whether it's in French Guiana, where like you have this UN outpost where the effort is really staged, you're out towards the North Pole on a Coast Guard ship, the other places in the world where things are just really going crazy. How do you ground the reality of this for the reader while presenting this extinction level event? Like, how did you balance that in the story?
I'm very lucky to be born in the age of the internet, and I have so much media at my fingertips. And for example, the European spaceport in South America, it's a real spaceport run by the European Union. And but it's also a tourist attraction because they give tours of it. So I can go to TripAdvisor and look at someone taking photos of all of the buildings, the rocket launcher, like they'll go to that site, the mission control. So I would say that I got to experience so much of this through other people. I could read blogs of the ship Healy, and that's also a real ship, Coast Guard Cutter Healy. I could read about a student from high school going on one of the expeditions. I could read his blog. I could look at satellite information and judge where the ship might be and how much ice there would be, both 10 years before the expedition and currently. So I could look at that. I could look at schematics of the ship, user manuals, a welcome aboard packet for the ship. Like, there was so much that I had access to. And then also for deeper dives, I would go to books. There's a middle grade book called Top of the World, where an ocean chemist describes her trip aboard the ship. And measuring the go flow bottles, taking water samples at different depths. I also read a lot about the Amazon and about the politics. I read about the Waipi. It's called Waiting for YY, and it's by a Scottish linguist. There's also a book called Blood and Earth, and that's about ecocide happening. And one of the chapters takes place in the Amazon and deals with the politics, and just he describes it as the Wild West because it is like the frontier of the forest, and you have people. It's almost like a gold rush. And anyone who stands in the way of that can be shot. They have environmental activists that stand in the way of. They try to protect their harvesting farmland, and they get killed. So there was so many ways that I tried to research this so that it wouldn't come off as shallow, and that goes for the characters as well, like where they came from culturally. Jen Liu, I read a book called Decode about a family that was brilliant in mathematics. And I think one of the patriarchs survived the Red Army by being a cryptographer. So I thought that might be a way for her to come from such an extraordinary family and be so extraordinary, but also live among everyone and just not really be world famous maybe, and kind of keep her genius tempered down. And also she was a woman. I tried to do as much research as it warranted so that it wouldn't come across as two-dimensional and a set. Like I wanted these to be real places, and some of them are the camaraderie on the ship Healy, the environments that they would have, like the lounges where they would be playing Nintendo and they'd be shadowboxing each other. It's just there are some really great moments of these settings, and I wanted them to really come alive.
There's something you mentioned there that I think is interesting when you mentioned, and I'm going to say the character's name, but Jen.
Jen, like
just Jen. Yeah,
we're probably both pronouncing it incorrectly, and we will have to be forgiven.
Yeah. But you talk about a character with genius and dealing in a world of whether or not you can be allowed to be renowned for it, or if you hide it in some way. There's a novel that came, or not a novel, but a book that came out a couple of years ago. It was like The Death of Expertise, and a lot of kind of thinking about, are we in an age where true expertise, true genius has actually been discounted or pushed to the background as punditry has jumped out way ahead of it, as the average person thinks that they can research on Google for 15 minutes and decides they're an expert on anything. And certainly Twitter has made the armchair expert become even more of a massive phenomenon. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing to touch on in this as well. I've seen some people describe this as a hard science novel, and I'm not sure how I feel about that offhand. I guess I have kind of an aversion to hard science and science fiction, because I even growing up, I don't know, I always found those novels kind of boring because I felt like I was getting hammered over the head with a lot of conceptual stuff that got in the way of the story for me. I'm okay with a certain level of hand-wavy science. Here, I don't think that I never felt like I was, taking the wrench of science research over the head. I always felt like you were giving just enough to make sure that I felt like I was grounded in something that felt real without making me feel like I needed to do math or something, because I don't do math and that's not going to happen in my reading experience. But I'm curious for you, like you said, you've pulled so much research, so much experiential stuff that you've boiled down to put into this story. When you're putting that much science into it, how do you approach putting that in there without overloading the audience and making sure that there's a sense of veracity without it feeling like it becomes a textbook that just happens to have a story in it?
I think I guess I was my own litmus test, because I wrote the book for me. I wasn't under contract. They were my weekends. I wrote, so I love science, but I agree. I'm not so interested in I guess hard science would be like the Andy Weir, The Martian, like where it's mostly the science is what takes center stage. There's a lot of science in the book, but I don't think it's center stage, or I didn't really mean it to be. I was very passionate about it, but when my attention started to wane, it was as much as I needed to use as a catalyst to talk about other things, to get into the characters, to get into the plot driving forward. I gave you as much as I needed personally, and then I kept moving. And you're right. Like I don't need everything that there needs to know about a comet. Like that there's a comet. I explain that, and then I'm like, okay, that's the inciting incident. We're gonna move forward because there's so much else to get to. That's exciting to me. So I guess I kind of was my own judge with the balance between explaining the science and having it there, but also pulling in so much else that I really wanted to get to the characters and what they were going through. I wanted to get to society, politics, like what would countries do, especially as I was living in a very nationalistic time. When would these countries band together and when would they not? Who would do that? Who wouldn't? So there was so much else I wanted to get to that I wanted the science to be part of it. I love science, but not the end all.
And I mean, you mentioned there like the political side of things too. I mean, we're in a moment where, we're under a pandemic, and we've seen that the leadership for a long stretch showed nothing but selfishness and barely reacted to it, often downplayed it, and put a lot of people at risk, and probably a lot of people died because of that selfishness. And that's a scary thing to look at when you're like, we're a people that are supposed to be ruled by reason and acting to help our fellow man. And instead our leadership just said, oh, no, hell no, like that doesn't move our our agenda. And so looking at this, I mean, there's a moment in the novel where basically the president and the cabinet just like peace out and go hang out in a bunker somewhere, and they take a really long time to assist. And I think most stories like this frame America as the first man in, because that's the nature of American storytelling, is that we like to focus on American exceptionalism and put us forward. I mean, things like Independence Day or anything else, any other movie that came out of here. Yeah, it's always like oh, finally the Americans are doing something, and in this one, America's sitting on the sidelines for a long stretch while the UN is doing the heavy lifting and pulling these people together. And I thought that was very reflective of this moment in time, far more realistic, and and gave me a lot to chew on, while also giving me that sense of existential dread of being an American and thinking, no, that tracks with how some things would go right now. So again, reflects the real world, hurts a little bit, but also I think that's the kind of stuff that a fiction reader does well to read and recognize that our reality isn't nearly as heroic as we want it to be sometimes, and that if we want that to change, we have to activate change in some way. Like we've mentioned, this is a large cast novel. It's very focused on the human experience while these things are going on. I mentioned a lot of names in that intro. We've mentioned a few more as we've gone along. There's a lot I left out just because, for brevity and the sake of, not overwhelming the audience and trying to get their head around how many people the story talks about, but it really does cover a lot of ground. I'm curious why you chose so many POVs and what specific narrative advantages those might have created for you in a story that is so all-encompassing, that is so global and massive. Like, what was your thinking behind that? How did that all evolve on the page for you?
I think that it adds to the idea of the scope. It is the planet that is under threat, and I wanted it to be told by the inhabitants, and that's more than, like you said, just Americans or the lead scientist who's a man and is going to save the day, and he'll be the hero. I wanted to tell the story through a community, a world community, and I think that adds to the scope of the book, and it is like a large scope. And it is the whole world that is at stake. I thought it was interesting because I did want to have third person limited, but you would have so many different perspectives that it started kind of filling in to give this broad idea of what was happening through many people's eyes.
There's definitely a lot of perspective to cover in this, because there are certain people who are operating with, like the Ben Schwartz character, who has been ready for this big picture. I'm not emotionally ready, but theoretically ready for it. But has to wrap his head around just absolutely massive problems that there aren't really enough time to solve. And then you have to jump to somebody like Rivka, who's over in New York and has to deal with the idea of just getting groceries, like as places lock down. And we've already been through a thing in real life where we could find out that people freaked out and bought all the toilet paper, and when it wasn't necessary to do so, but that is the nature of our situation. There's a scene in the novel where she sees a couple of guys get in a fist fight at a grocery store over somebody having too many boxes of Cheerios, because he's like, man, you can't, you have to let somebody else have some more of that. And that just felt very real to our moment in time, where we have seen people get into conflicts over things like that. And you've seen that some people will hoard while other people will be left hanging with nothing. And that creates an enormous imbalance. I think that's probably a metaphor for our social casts and how we work financially as well. But anyway, that's too big for the moment. When we're talking about all these different characters, how do you track all those timelines? How do you keep track? Because the novel isn't entirely linear, in the sense of, you have the main thread going on. You're jumping between these couple of different locales. There are a few flashback chapters in there. Sometimes when we're seeing the things that are happening on the Healy, we're kind of a little bit ahead or a little bit behind of where the main thrust is going. What were your choices for that, as far as the timing and the pacing? And just, from an nuts and bolts standpoint, how did you keep track of all that?
Well, there's the arc, and then there's the timeline, and the arcs of the characters. I felt pretty with those, because I was lovingly obsessed with the characters. So I was very in tune with their arcs and where they were headed and where they began and where they ended. If you want to know how I kept track of their timelines in a word, I would say poorly. As a debut author, that was one of my amateur mistakes. I didn't do nearly enough documentation. And my editor was very kind and said, we'll have a copy editor kind of work with you to kind of really flesh it out. We also employed later things where I don't know if you in the chapter beginnings it says a countdown if it's before, so that really kind of helps a reader understand where you are on the doomsday clock of the launch window of when we need to launch an intercept vehicle or we're toast. So each chapter would have that, or it wouldn't. Before the discovery, there wasn't a launch window, so it wouldn't have that. That would really help a reader understand, and also explain as characters grew more extreme. You saw that countdown, and also in the defense effort, they have an effort watch that flips between military time and a countdown time, and you see them constantly checking, reflective, like we check our phones, constantly checking, nervously checking, and losing time because it's going so quickly. That I brought that in during edits. I'm like, okay, I think this will help the reader and me understand the actual countdown. And yeah, so it was just things like that, and actually just documenting the timeline, getting that document, putting things in place helped. But yeah, I would say the arcs were I understood my characters like I understood myself. Timelines, I needed some help and I got it, and I'm very grateful.
Funnily, when you mentioned the watches, the effort are all wearing that do that tracking. So like right before our interview started, my dog demanded to go outside, and so I was out in my backyard in snow boots, watching my watch because I knew I needed to be back in here so we could get on this call. And I stood there for a moment and had that realization that was like, oh, I'm experiencing what the effort does just on like 1/1,000,000th scale, right? Like I just need to get in and switch a button on so that I can record an interview. These people are like, oh, this time runs out and all of humanity and everything on the planet dies. Very apples to oranges, but I definitely had this moment of feeling like a reflection of that in my real life, and it amused me in the moment, even as I was feeling a little anxious about my dog getting her business done so I could get inside. You mentioned you got a lot of editorial help on this, and as a debut author, when you come in with a novel that has this many POVs, this much complication, do you even saying that this is a debut novel and something that you wrote for yourself on your weekends? This is a big undertaking. There's a lot of complication to cover here and huge thematic stuff. What was the editorial response to that? Like, where did they work with you to tighten up the narrative, or what were their feedback on characters? Was it a push for more or less characters in there? What did that all look like?
It was a little different before as I sold it, there was more weight on one of the characters, and my editor was very wise and said, we need to cut him back. So it was Gustavo. I ended up cutting 4 of his chapters, and they were long chapters, of his journey, his time in the Amazon. She said, if you're going for an ensemble cast, you need to kind of make that true. You need to cut him back a lot. And then I want you to build up the other characters and make everyone kind of equal footing, and true ensemble. So, and that was exactly what needed to happen. It was spot on. It was great advice. It hurt. It was great advice. And so I cut him way back. I built in backstories, like Jen's backstory in China, showing her brilliance at such a young age and her personal experience of her cleft palate and lip surgeries. I brought in the Planetary Defense Conference in Washington, D.C., and got to show Ben and Amy in a better time where they were a loving couple, just regular, having a great day, but also showing the scenarios and how he became the fortune teller. I brought in Jack and his mother, and I explained that relationship more, and brought in where he got his scars and how his mother kind of nursed him back to health and was at the same time screaming at him for nearly dying, and she blamed him, not the sniper bullet. So I brought in so much more of them because I had that space. My editor actually isn't even that much into science fiction. she told me from the start, I bought your book because of your characters. And so I had buy-in on them from the beginning, which I'm extremely lucky to have had. She understood how hard it was to create them, and she wanted to protect them and not bring it down to one protagonist or something like that.
Well, and I think at the very least, when you have, like you said, like Gustavo's, a lot of his stuff is on the cutting room floor. A lot of things had to change. If the novel ever gets optioned for a series, you just have a lot of extra stuff for the for the show Bible, right? Like there's a lot to build on. I mean, certainly there is a feeling like comparable to things like Lost or something. I mean, I guess like Walking Dead is kind of similar to that too, where you have expansive casts that are all going different directions and stuff. Where like that has that kind of feel here. Somehow you manage to pace a solidly sized but not oversized novel with this many characters and this much going on and giving us a lot to do. I don't feel like the pace of the novel ever flags. This always keeps moving, and in something with this much science, this many like I don't digressions isn't the right word, but like branching paths. That's saying something, because most of the time when I run into novels like this, they tend to get mired when it comes to pacing, and I feel like you always bring it back around. You never let it linger too long in one of those places and let it slow down, which I think is an impressive feat. In talking about characters, this is a small thing, but it's something that it scares me from the standpoint of writing anything where you're using contemporary type names set in the real world, is the danger of naming a character something that's already somebody in the real world. And so for me, that was the fact that like Benjamin Schwartz, there's an actor named Ben Schwartz that I like a lot. And now I cannot separate that person from this character in my head. But Ben Schwartz is a comedic actor. And so that was a little bit of a pitfall. I don't know if you're aware of that actor or knew that there was a person out there. And so I think about that all the time when writing novels. Google it afterwards. He's hilarious. He's an absolutely fantastic and not a complete antithesis for this character. So it was a little bit of a readjustment in my brain. And I basically just had to tell myself, I'm like, could Ben Schwartz do a serious role? And I was like, of course he could. He's a good actor. So it ended up working for me. But I think that's always a little bit of a pitfall in going into something like this. And it depends on where you're at in the world of pop culture, because he's certainly not a famous actor, but he's also somebody who was on Parks and Rec and has a couple of Netflix specials and was a voice on DuckTales, stuff like that. So it's like, if that gives you a framework for what kind of actor we're talking about, it's always kind of wacky. But when you're talking about this many characters, I mean, we've mentioned a ton of them, and they are balanced through the novel. If you had to pick a couple to say were kind of your through line characters, the ones that like one of the plot arcs is following that character, who would you say a few of those are? Who would you center this story around?
Probably the two missions, the defense effort and then the Healy ship. And then I would say also New York. So I would say Ben and Amy and Love in the defense effort. And then the ship, it would be Jack, Maya, and Gustavo. And then it would be Rivka in New York. So that's down to 7. Is that good enough?
Yeah.
Who's among my children?
Right. Yeah. I mean, a challenge when you have that many compelling characters that you're deeply attached to, for sure. I did appreciate as somebody who is from when we can have conventions, I'm right out of the Comic-Con circuit, and so having somebody like Amy in there who is a tech recruiter person, but was also, I mean, she's described at one point as like the hottest ticket from the Comic-Con circuit. I was curious when I read that. I was like, and reading them talking about like they have like a shared like obsession with anime and stuff, and they're very much from the nerd world, but he just happens to be a NASA scientist and she's like a tech person. What's your own grounding from that in the real world? Were they inspired by anybody that specifically, from that nerd world, or your own experience with it, or like how did that kind of tie in? I'm just curious.
So I am married to a scientist. And so I have a window into, and it's more like academia, it's not government. But I do have a window into hard science environment. And so I sometimes joke that I imagine myself as a nerd groupie, because I am a nerd, right? But I also I just find it so, like, what they can do, I just find so amazing. So it was kind of like a little fun where she is a bit of a groupie, but she's also a tech recruiter. So you know that it's her job to be a bit of a groupie and to be completely starstruck by the head nerd at NASA. And that's why people look at them together and they don't get it. But it actually, totally makes sense, which I think is kind of fun. And Amy's great. I really enjoyed writing her. And I kind of have like a trope fake out where in the beginning you have the professor who's an old Oxford Don who kind of picks Ben to lead the effort. He ends up, and he would be a trope, but I actually don't really focus on him. This isn't his story. Whereas you have Amy, who is not a scientist herself and, could be like the babe, but instead really pulls her weight at the defense effort. And in a way that is realistic, it's not far-fetched. She uses her very real skill set and does major work there. So I kind of like to play on that in a bit and do some fake outs here and there.
I like that, yeah, Amy does have a real role in it. And I think that sometimes when you get all the most brilliant people together, they tend to focus on their specialties and forget that human resources is a real thing, that balancing people is a real thing. Figuring out how to negotiate the emotional boundaries of people is a challenge and a skill. And particularly when they're foregoing sleep and running on cat naps, and while they're trying to do massive equations and figure out resource management and stuff, you need somebody who will run around and take care of them. And that is part of what she kind of is in this. If she was a D&D party, she'd be the cleric, and she would be keeping people like surviving together. I play a lot of D.
Right there, you're just like...
Oh yeah. Oh, I'm a game master, so yeah, I immediately start thinking about yeah. In approaching this as a debut author, do you have a plotting system that you adhere to? And do you kind of identify as a pantser, discovery writer, or a plotter, something in between? What does that look like for you process-wise?
I would say this book was a discovery novel. I set out on a path, but I did allow myself to be kind of swayed by what was happening, what I was reading in the news, the places the research took me, and just what I was feeling. So I would say that this novel in particular was a discovery. I think next time in my second one, I will be more planning it out in the beginning and really kind of understanding what I want to say and what I want to do, how I want to do that. So I think I will have more planning for the second one, but I'm okay with where I'm very proud of what I did. So I'm okay with the discovery, and I'm glad that despite those people that wanted the blockbuster, there was even a huge director that was interested, and his people wanted to buy it without reading it. And my film rights person's like, no, this isn't what you think it is. This isn't The Martian. And then they read it and they're like, oh, never mind. it's just, but I'm glad that I wrote what I wrote, because I think it's important in a very different way. So I'm glad it was a discovery. But number two, I believe I would like to know more of my agenda before I start filling in the fleshing it out.
You mentioned too, kind of touching on tropes there. That's an increasing topic of conversation on this show, just because I think audiences and writers are more aware of it now than they used to be. Is that something, I mean, you mentioned right there, like the aging professor at the beginning could be very tropey. You subvert that to a certain degree. Every story, tropes are building blocks. So are there any you were conscious of as you were getting into this? And if you were conscious of them, were you thinking about, okay, if I don't want this to be cliche, I need to go a different direction this, or can I mold this in a different way, or how do I make this work?
Yes, I definitely was aware of some tropes, and some I can talk about, and some are maybe further on in the book that I don't want to give away. But I definitely had an idea of this trope and would kind of play with it, because it's more fun to turn it on its head, or to use some of the properties, because a lot of things that are cliches in life, there's a reason there's a cliche. So you would have some of those properties, but then also it's never always that thing, that 100%. It's really fun to kind of twist it halfway, as to, in this instance, it's not certain things. It's actually D, not A. And just kind of twist it. So I like to have fun with tropes. It would be very boring to have them as they are, like 100%. But I think it's kind of fun to twist them around.
Definitely, for sure. And again, they're building blocks. So I mean, if you can slot them in there and then put the rest of the citing on them or something that makes them something special. I mean, that's the beauty of writing and constructing a fictional world. And then last thing, before we wrap up, what are your tools of the trade? What did you write in?
So yeah, so when I get this question, I get kind of embarrassed because it's like Microsoft Word, a pen and paper, and then I would have to say either wine or gin.
There's the honesty we were looking for.
And then that's it. I'm like, there are other tools. Yeah, I guess I'm old school that way. It's just standard word processing, pen and paper. Sometimes when you're at an airport or in a flight and you can't open your laptop, it's kind of fun to just kind of scrawl things out longhand. Yeah, one glass of wine at the end of a day, and just or even in the mornings. I find no, sorry, no wine in the morning. Just waking up. Yeah, no, just the idea of it being early and your brain is not like it's kind of in a flexible state and it's not yet solidified. I find that it's more easy to imagine in the mornings when you're fresh and you've got your cup of coffee and you're just sitting there. So I would say those are my tools.
How many drafts and revisions did this novel go through?
Lots. It definitely took a lot. And then when I can't give you a number because I lost track. But when I sold it, then it was a major edit round. But the editor was very pleased after the first edit round, and I really busted my chops, ideating on the characters, cutting, adding, solving, timeline. Like that was a major undertaking that I had a couple months to do. And then it was just like, I think 2 more after that. And then, cleaning up with copy editing and a proofer. Yeah. So I would say like once I sold it, not so many, but it was the process before on my own. And my poor readers, my parents and my husband, who I abused by giving them my writing, that was the drudgery. But I mean, it's worth it. It's, as I said, that's why I wrote it for myself. It wouldn't have been worth it if I had written that blockbuster for someone else. It wouldn't have been worth it.
For sure. Well, like I said at the top, pull it in here. I have, the paperback advanced readership here. This is probably not even going to be in the camera, so I'll stick it in here. But the effort is out now. I'm definitely seeing a lot of buzz around this novel. I mean, clearly we're at the beginning of the year, and people are starting to already formulate their what are going to be the best novels of 2021, or the most compelling, or the most prescient, or whatever they are. And I hope this one's not prescient. I would really like that to not be the case. But clearly this book has a lot to say. You have a lot to say about the state of the world, about how we handle things as humanity, as cultures, looking at some of the beauty of the world dwindling under the impact of us just existing and doing our human thing. There's a lot to chew on here. There's a lot to scare you, but there's a lot to make you hope. And there's hopefully a lot that reminds us that we can take an active role in trying to make things better. And I think that's an important thing to take away in a really strange moment in time for us. So I think it's worth the effort. Oh my God, that was awful. I should cut that because I am not punny, but it is definitely a novel people should dive into and explore and enjoy. Get their their spec fic itch scratched by this novel. And Claire, thank you so much for joining me on Fictitious.
It has been my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.